I know that we are going to have more people joining here over the next few minutes, but I'm trying to get things started off at the right time. Good afternoon and welcome to Texas Homeless Network's monthly virtual event series. If we haven't met before, my name is Nick Thompson and I am the statewide initiatives manager. What that means is I co-direct our THN's federal policy initiatives and our Texas chapter of the Opportunity Starts at Home campaign. Today, we are joined by two representatives from our national partners, the National Low Income Housing Coalition and the National Alliance to End Homelessness. So Olivia Arena and Steve Berg will be speaking about national strategies to increase resources and advocacy efforts during this new Biden administration to help reduce housing insecurity and homelessness across the country. And they'll be focusing on this with a particular focus on how these campaigns, strategies, and recently passed legislation will impact the people of Texas. A little bit about this webinar before I pass over the mic to Olivia. Please use the chat function to ask your questions throughout this presentation. Both of the speakers have indicated that they're looking forward to your questions during their presentations. And at the end of both Olivia and Steve's presentations, we'll have another moment to ask them questions as a panel. Let's go ahead and practice the chat feature and go ahead and introduce yourself and one thing that you would like to learn in this webinar in the chat box. In a minute, I'll be turning off my camera and mic, but I'll still be around in case you have technical assistance needs as well. Without further ado, let me pass it off to another Texan at NLIHC. Olivia, off to you.
Awesome. Hi, everyone. My name is Olivia Arena. I am a Texan. I was born and raised in Houston, Texas, and I went to the University of Texas at Austin before I moved out to Washington, D.C. So I know a little bit about what it's like in Texas. I know a little bit about the political environment. I know what it's like to live in Houston and Austin and how rapidly those cities and the housing environments are changing. And because I'm a Texan and have deep pride in the state, I still stay very much plugged in with what's happening. So happy to, provide my own perspective, but now I work at the national level. So I will go ahead, if my presentation could be pulled up. And I can go ahead and get started and talk a little bit about my organization, the federal work we do, and how important it is to be involved in advocacy and what some of the initial steps can be. I'll introduce kind of how we think about advocacy, which I think personally, though I'm a little bit biased, is a great way to just plug in at any level of government. So I'll go ahead, if you want to advance the slide. So I first want to talk about and ground what I'm going to say in something that I'm sure many of you are already aware of, which is the centrality and importance of having an affordable home. So we know that long before COVID, there was a housing affordability crisis and homelessness crisis in our country. And we also know that having an affordable home that's safe, decent, and accessible is central to all areas of a person's life. So we know that people are healthier, economic productivity is increased, student outcomes are better when folks have an affordable home. And we know that this crisis has only gotten worse during the COVID pandemic. We've seen a lot of emergency actions, which I will talk about a little bit later. But, we're trying to be optimistic and think that there was a lot of great reaction to recognizing housing as a central part of public health. And we really think we can build on that momentum under a Biden administration. So I also want to be clear, because I know I'm presenting in Texas, that this housing affordability crisis is not an urban issue. There is not a single county in our country where someone working minimum wage can afford a 2-bedroom rental apartment. So we know that folks are working for less sometimes than minimum wage, but we know that at minimum wage, they're working sometimes 1 to 2 jobs and still struggling to afford rent. And what that means is that there's very little left over. We also know that there are proven solutions to end homelessness and address housing affordability, but what we believe is missing is political will to actually enact some of those policies and changes. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. Next slide. So at the National Low Income Housing Coalition, our mission is focused on achieving socially just public policy to ensure that people with the lowest incomes have affordable and decent homes. And while there are a lot of housing organizations that focus on federal policy, we are unique in that we focus on renters with the lowest incomes, those who are most likely to fall into homelessness, have housing instability, be evicted. And we also don't represent any particular industry or developer or landlord. So we actually have a pretty large umbrella of folks that we consider members. And because of that, we actually think about many different facets of the housing movement. Next slide. Because we have that broad umbrella, we actually have a variety of different members. So we have homeless service providers, developers, housing policy advocates, elected officials, housing authorities, and residents can actually be individual members and participate in our advocacy. So we're listening to all of these different voices, but keeping a mind towards the people in our country that have the lowest incomes, the least resources, and have historically been the most marginalized. So one more slide. The reason that we do this and focus on lower income renters is because our research shows that that's where the greatest need is, and that by focusing solutions on the lowest income renters, it will actually alleviate housing issues further up the income ladder. So if you look at this graph, this chart, you'll actually see that 72.5% of extremely low income renters are severely housing cost burdened. And what that means is we think of extremely low income renters as renters who are making 30% of area median income or below. So not 100%, but much lower. And housing cost burdened, especially severely housing cost burdened, is that they're spending more than 50% of their income on rent. So that means one of their two paychecks is immediately going to pay their rent. And that again leaves very little left over for all those other elements of life. Next slide. One way that you can see this and kind of the ripple effect that it has at higher income ladders is we provide an annual gap report that provides a helpful picture of this. Extremely low income renters, so those two bars in red, are the only income group facing an absolute shortage of affordable homes. So there's 10.8 million extremely low income renter households, and there's only 7.4 million units that are affordable and available to them. And you'll notice that I keep saying affordable and available. That's because at higher income levels, if you're making more money, you can always rent a cheaper apartment and save some money. But if you're already starting with less, there are less units that are available for you to live in. And actually, we found that higher income renters are living in those more affordable units, meaning that folks that have very little have very few options. They're on many waiting lists. They're really struggling to find units. The supply isn't there. So overall, the US has a shortage of about 6.8 million rental homes that are affordable and available to extremely low income renters. So that's a huge gap, and you'll hear me talk about later supply and how there's not enough affordable and available units, but we know that's just one piece of the puzzle. Next slide. We know that, like I mentioned, folks are working around the country and they just cannot keep up with housing prices. So this is a map from our Out of Reach report that shows the two-bedroom rental housing wage in each state. So this is the amount that a renter needs to earn. In Texas, it's $20.90 an hour to afford a two-bedroom rental home. So in Texas, I know the minimum wage is $7.25. The fact that wages have remained stagnant, especially for lower wage jobs, while rents have increased due to increased demands and inadequate supply and increased cost of construction, means that there's a mismatch, right? This is where we see that intersection of housing and labor. It's not that people aren't working, it's that they're not being paid enough and housing costs have not kept pace. So across the country, the average is that someone needs to be making $23.96 an hour for a modest two-bedroom apartment. At $7.25, a worker must work almost over two full-time jobs, so 97 hours a week to be able to afford a two-bedroom. It's just not possible given how much folks are making in many of our different jobs and how much housing costs. So again, another element, another piece of the pie. Next slide. But I'm going to ground this in what it looks like in Texas. So these are what those figures look like in the Lone Star State. 22% of renter households are extremely low income. And I know I said that that's 30% of area and median income. what that looks like is a family of 4 making around $26,000 a year. So 22% of Texans, 22% of Texas renter households are making below $26,000 a year for a family of 4. That shortage that I talked about, those numbers in red, in Texas, that's around 594,000 units that are not affordable or available to extremely low income renters. If a renter in Texas is finding a place to stay, 74% of extremely low income renters are spending 50% or more of their income on housing. And if we look at this chart over on the left-hand side of your screen, this is what extremely low-income renter households look like. I want to bust the myth that folks are not working. In fact, 43% are in the labor force, 22% are seniors, 17% are disabled or are caregivers. So these aren't folks that are, these are folks that are working and, like I mentioned, can't make ends meet, or are seniors or disabled. So it's really important that we think about our housing policy is encompassing all of those different renters. And again, really crafting policy for the lowest income renters and most marginalized in mind. Next slide. So I've talked a little bit about housing cost burden. Here's an example of when I say you're spending one of your paychecks on rent, what you're giving up. In a survey, 61% of people in the US say that they have had to make at least one sacrifice in the past 3 years because they were struggling to pay for housing. That might mean they take an additional job, they skip bills, they skip out on medical expenses, or maybe cut back on prescriptions. Maybe they've stopped saving for retirement, or they're not eating healthy foods. These are all sacrifices that families are making so that they can afford to stay in their homes. And ultimately, all of these elements are really important for a dignified, exciting, and vibrant life, which we believe everyone is entitled to. So I've kind of grounded the first part of my presentation in data that shows where our organization focuses and how important affordable housing is. I've kind of shown some of the figures that help to flesh out, our policy background and agenda, but I'm going to pause now before I go on to advocacy to see if anyone has any questions. I can go ahead and look at the chat unless I'll be asked them by one of the Texas Homeless Network team. Let's see. I'm not seeing any questions, so I'll go on. I'll keep talking. Okay, I'll keep talking, but feel free to post any questions in the chat and I'll get to them. I have 1 to 2 more pauses in my presentation. So let's go on to advocacy. Next slide. All of this information really grounds the work that we do. So we have research that backs up our federal policy asks, and those numbers are really important, but they're only one piece of advocacy. So when I say advocacy, some different things may come to mind. In our opinion, advocacy is simply educating others about the issues we care about to push for changes that we want to see in our communities. So many of you, as individual community members or social service providers, see the affordable housing crisis in action every day. And you can have a tremendous impact by sharing these stories with your elected officials and urging them to act. Unfortunately, though, we often hear, well, my elected officials don't care, they're a lost cause, or they already support this issue, so why bother? Next slide. We encourage you that when you think about advocacy, actually to think of it on a spectrum. So what's the goal? It's not one or the other. It's not a yes or no. It's actually moving your elected officials from a staunch opponent to a staunch supporter. You want to determine not where they stand on the issue, but how to move them along the spectrum. So let's say that your elected official is a staunch opponent of affordable housing. Your goal with advocacy might be to just get them to be a little bit quieter on affordable housing or their objections. Or let's say they're already a supporter. Your goal might be to nudge them to speak up more and be more vocal about the elements of affordable housing and the homelessness crisis that you really care about. You might push them to get out of their comfort zone. Again, it's not one or the other, but we believe that there's always these ongoing conversations, these ongoing relationships that can help to move some of your elected officials. Next slide. And I want to emphasize that your views matter. As constituents, your views play a very large role in your elected officials' policy choices, maybe more than you think, because at the end of the day, you're their boss. You've elected them into office and they have to answer to you, their constituents. It's one of the things they value, and it's something that's very important to utilize. Not only do you have expertise on the issues like affordable housing and homelessness through your work or your personal life, but you also have the ability to vote them out or keep them in office. So it's really engaging that power, engaging that story, and reaching out, understanding that you really can make a difference and that you can make an impact. It might just be in a different way than you're used to viewing it. By sharing your views, you can play a central role in reinforcing or shifting thinking on issues. Next slide. So if you're thinking about an advocacy campaign or how you can be an advocate, this might sound really overwhelming, but these are some of the pillars that I think you can just think about if you're thinking, you know, I want to engage with my city council member, or I want to engage with someone on the school board, or maybe your federal delegation. You want to identify your goal, and this will help inform the steps that follow. You'll want to identify the right target. So doing your research to understand what they value, what they care about, and what tactics you might want to use. Always assess your strengths and weaknesses for your campaign. So do you have certain connections that might be helpful? Do you have influence with the media? Are you more limited capacity? And something that I think is really important is always asking who's in the room and who's not in the room. What voices are at the table, and how can we use that as a strength to get our message across? Here at the Coalition, we believe that it's important to center the most marginalized, people who have been affected and who have lived experience. That's why we're often listening to our members, and that's why I will always take your feedback about the things I'm saying. It's important that you broaden your base and also to bring these voices into the conversation, recognizing where a strength or a limitation might be in your coalition. Also, creating an agenda. Affordable housing is a huge issue, as I will continue to talk about, but there can be specific items that you want to address with an elected official, council member, a specific bill, and you want to create an agenda so that that meeting will flow naturally and you'll be able to hit all of your important priority points. The same can be said for messaging. If you're using social media, which we've really seen a rise in things like Twitter, you want to be specific in your message. You want to use either get everyone on the same page, you want to use social media, but then also not neglect things like traditional media, written materials to share with the community, or talking points for events. And I mentioned this a little bit already, but it's important to broaden your base and build power. So already talking to your neighbors about things you're seeing in your community, being here today, learning more about why things are the way they are and where you can move the needle, all of those are really important to learning more about how you're going to craft your campaign and to bringing others in the movement along with you. We've talked a lot at the National Low Income Housing Coalition about the importance of cross-sector partnerships. So how can we talk with the healthcare community? How can we talk with educators? How can we talk with the business community about the way affordable housing impacts all of those different sectors? Next slide. So I've talked about this a little bit, and so I'll just touch on it one more time. But it's important in an advocacy campaign and in your personal advocacy to think of it as an ongoing relationship. It's not a single meeting. It's more of a conversation. So continuing to provide information, to follow up with your elected officials, and to emphasize what you're seeing on the ground, that can be an open flow of communication. And it also takes the pressure off of any single meeting to change their opinion. Some of the tools that I've mentioned are social media, op-eds, letters to the editor, press briefings, and then connecting directly with decision makers through call-in days, meetings, or events or demonstrations. All of these are tools in your toolkit as an advocate, a personal advocate at different levels of government. Next slide. And the last thing I'll say, and again, just plugging the numbers that I've already given, we produce these two reports, The Gap and Out of Reach, which really talk about some of the numbers behind the larger affordable housing crisis. So when I talk about how much you would need to make in Texas, those numbers can be really important to talk about the scope of the problem. but your individual personal experience around how hard it was to make ends meet with your job, or how you saw a neighbor struggling, or how many hours you have to work, any of that can help contextualize and really emphasize the numbers that are provided in these resources. I'll put a link to some of these in the chat after I finish presenting, but we provide numbers again on that shortage of affordable housing units, as well as how much folks need to work. And we also put out a variety of other reports and publications on specific issues that relate to tenants, including articles that are written by low-income tenants, and the Advocates Guide, which is a resource to everything I'm talking about today and any federal housing program. So that's a little bit about advocacy and how we frame it, some of the tools I think you can use. Next slide. I'll pause again for any other questions. Take a look at the chat before I go on to what we're emphasizing with our advocacy and what we hope you can help emphasize under the Biden administration.
We do have some questions now. Go ahead, Craig.
Okay.
Kiana asks, how do we use data collected at our local homeless coalitions to influence our state officials?
Yeah, that's a great question. I will say in my previous role, I was a mixed methods researcher. So I understood one of the things we studied was how to gather qualitative information. So like stories that are collected respectfully through interviews or focus groups or lived experience, how stories can be coupled with data, like collected data around what you're seeing in a specific community. Both of those are really helpful in making the case for where's the breakdown in services? How are folks entering, how are folks experiencing housing instability? What does housing instability look like? How is that changing? I'm a big proponent of local data, so I definitely love the census and I love ACS data. I love all of these big ways of looking at trends across time and over different geographies. But I think having localized data can be really, really helpful in explaining the nuance of a specific situation. So looking at the high level numbers, there's 6.8 million affordable homes that's the shortage in our country. When you're talking to your elected official at the state level, they're gonna say, okay, but what does that look like in Texas? If you're talking to someone at the city of Houston, they might say, okay, well, how do I know that shortage isn't just in California? Having more localized data can be really important in really grounding what you're saying and talking to someone and saying, when you walk around the city, this is what that looks like. When you're in this neighborhood, this is what, this is what the neighborhoods, this is the cost of living here. This is how many folks are renters. All of that can be really important to illuminating challenges that you're seeing. I think also data collection and data reporting can be helpful in identifying gaps. So, you don't really know what you don't know until you're asking, hey, how did we get into this situation? What crisis are we seeing? Where are folks coming from? Why are they coming to our specific social service provider? All of those questions can be answered, I think, in data collection and can be really helpful in identifying gaps and potential solutions that might be more nuanced than, again, like what I'm going to talk about at the federal level.
Jane is asking, how does Texas compare to other states in housing affordability?
Yeah, so I can go back to, let me see. So I work at a variety of different places. I also think, here I'm going to use this, what I just said is I think that it's important to think about how localized things can be. So in Texas, it's going to look really different in Amarillo than it is going to be in Austin, Texas. Thinking about the housing, the area that you're talking about, even within Texas, even within the metro area, housing might be really expensive in central Austin, but you're moving out to Round Rock or Del Valley, and actually it's much cheaper. So I think that it's important to think about both the metro areas, again, the smaller the area that you're looking at, what that landscape looks like. If we're going back to the housing wage across the country, Texas is kind of right in the middle. Housing stock isn't going to be as expensive statewide on average as somewhere like California, Washington, or New York, but also the minimum wage is much lower in Texas. So you have to compare those different things. And also it's going to be, you know, much more expensive to live in a metro area or a city in Texas. So, you know, it's also rapidly changing. I will say that because we're using national data, a lot of times we're 2 years behind. So that map I put up of the United States and the housing wage, that data is from 2018. So you think about, you know, the past year and how that's changed the housing landscape. A lot of times that's not captured. It's on a delay at the national data level. So Texas overall, I will say, you know, I think you really have to get to the granular level, right? Is it more affordable than New York City or New York? Maybe. Is it, you know, more expensive than Montana? Yeah, maybe. And then you look at the specific metro area. So like Austin's very expensive, Houston's very expensive, Dallas, but it's all in comparison. I know that kind of sounds like a cop-out. I will say overall, Texas, the cost of, you know, housing is kind of central in the country, but really when you get down to the local jurisdiction, that's where you're going to see, you know, what the real cost of living is. The closer you get, the smaller the geography that you're looking at.
And there's one more, and this was actually mine. So in dealing with your elected officials, is there a better channel of communication? Does one weigh more than the other? Like, is in person always going to top out an email, or is a letter way more than an email kind of thing? Especially,
you know, I think really we're learning for the first time what that looks like, what an in-person meeting versus a virtual meeting looks like. And, you know, we've been doing advocacy virtually. We haven't been meeting with elected officials. We're all remote in our jobs. We've been able to pass about $50 billion in emergency rental assistance. So I would say we're fairly effective virtually. But I think like this has definitely changed some of the advocacy that I think can happen. I will say, you know, in-person events, that allows more people to participate. Conversations might be like a little bit more organic or more people in the room. The conversation might evolve differently, but there's something to be said for a virtual option. And that means that, you know, everyone can jump on a Zoom in Texas and here you're talking to me in Washington, D.C. That's the same for your elected officials. You can set up a meeting and it might be much more accessible that folks can just join that Zoom and be able to talk with them. Now, I think that where the strength comes in is in a meeting with an elected official. Like I said, being really specific about what the ask is, crafting an agenda, knowing who's going to talk when, what you want to emphasize. And if you're looking at it, you know, as a repeated engagement, leaving that conversation and asking a question, you know, yes or no, do you support this bill? Can I follow up with you with more information? Oh, you liked that data? I'm going to send you some updated data that might, you know, flesh out that might be a little bit more clear. You know, always having an ask so that you can continue that conversation and relationship building. I think that's very important. And I think that happens more in conversation. So while it's important to maybe send a bunch of letters, send many emails, those conversations where someone can hear your story directly from you and you can follow up and you can initiate and then you can kind of leave the door cracked to be able to come back, I think that's really powerful. So I think whether it's someone who's your elected official and they're coming back to their district, right, because they need to be in Texas to hear from constituents, I think that's one opportunity. If you want to ground it, you know, maybe post-COVID and you're getting together in person, that can be really strong. But I think it'll be interesting to see how meetings evolve moving forward and the accessibility of having virtual meetings when you're talking with your elected officials.
Cool. Okay, and Jen's asking.
Go ahead. Don't underestimate media. So like, don't underestimate placing an op-ed. Don't underestimate, you know, talking on the radio, because think about the different ways in which people are reached. I know social media, Twitter is like really, in DC, it feels like everyone is on Twitter and I learn everything from Twitter. But then I think about how different folks consume information. Folks are still reading their local newspaper, still listening to the radio, using any of those more traditional means of media. Those are great ways to garner attention, and it can also be circulated more broadly. So I would also say that, like, you know, media is an ally in advocacy.
Cool. Okay, Jen's got, for historically oppressed groups, that them having influence over politicians isn't always seen as a viable option. How can we engage historically oppressed groups to better enable them to get involved?
Yes, So I think, and I'll talk about this a little later in our this next set when I talk about our policy priorities. We've been doing a lot of thinking around racial equity and what it means to really emphasize the leadership and support of community-based organizations, and community-based organizations that have trust, are led by, are in partnership or tandem with historically marginalized or oppressed groups. So that's something that we think is really important. And we think that, I'm going to talk a lot about federal resources. Those federal resources are going to flow down to communities. And I think it's important that communities are represented and that community-based organizations are represented by members of those marginalized groups, so that it's not just in the room and not just at the table, but really shaping conversations, shaping programs. In our own personal organization, we have members, low-income renters, different large membership organizations. I kind of listed out the different types of members that we have, and we try to provide opportunities for everyone to give input. I think part of the role that many of our organizations play is that we're both we're an advocacy organization, but also a convener. So just creating space to have folks in the room to be able to vocalize and to show that you're listening, right? We have a call once a month called Tenant Talk, where it's a space for low-income tenants to come together and talk about policy priorities, to talk about issues affecting their lives, to have this conversation where they can learn and share ideas. And it's important for us to both provide that space, but also to learn from folks there about the ways in which their lives are being impacted. I'll put on my former, organization hat, working in research, social and economic policy research. But I also think it's very important that if you're bringing folks to the table who have been historically marginalized and oppressed, that they're compensated for their time, and that you remove barriers, right? It can't just be a meeting that's happening during business hours where you're not mindful of how many different shifts folks are working, or the fact that I'm paid to be there, right? But folks aren't paid to give their time and their input. What does it look like to provide childcare or transportation or dinner? So I think having a really concerted focus on, in research, we would call it community engagement. But I think just in base building and movement building, I think it's really important to meet folks where they're at and to understand that, it's really intimidating, still intimidating for me to go to a meeting with an elected official. So what are the opportunities for leadership development, capacity building, coaching? How can you meet folks where they're at and understand maybe their own hesitations? That's on the advocacy engagement level. When you're crafting policy, I think it's really important to add a racial equity lens. So you'll hear me talk about this in a minute. It's, not being naive to the impacts of federal housing policy for generations. So being mindful of how federal policy has been harmful in the past, has been discriminatory in the past, and really grounding work moving forward in realistically in rectifying some of those wrongs and harms. And I think that's where housing and the idea of justice comes in. What does it look like to really be intentional in the policies you're promoting as tools, for good and for advancing and for being realistic about, removing barriers for folks where barriers have been set up for generations. That's kind of a meandering response, but I think it's both on the individual level with how you engage participant, how you engage individuals and community members who rightfully have been distrustful of the political arena. And then at a macro level, when you're crafting policy and you're creating opportunities for dialogue, how are you really acknowledging, that past harm, and how are you creating opportunities and policies that rebalance those power imbalances? So I think it's those two dualities at the same time.
That was all the questions for this section. So if you want to move.
Yes. So let me talk about some of the things I've kind of been alluding to, which are policy priorities. So we're a nonpartisan organization, and we at NLIHC support any good housing policy that helps us achieve our mission, regardless of what side of the aisle it comes from, because we believe that good housing policy affects every person and every community across the political spectrum. Unsurprisingly, most of the last year has been dedicated to emergency COVID relief and response measures. And some of our key priorities, these huge priorities, have been addressed in some of the relief and recovery packages. However, we think it's important that while we celebrate and acknowledge these important measures to protect renters, to help alleviate housing pressures, maybe help people at risk of housing instability, people experiencing homelessness, we still have a lot of work to do to address the underlying housing affordability crisis that was here before COVID. So next slide. I talked a little bit about this, but emergency actions. So we've advocated for emergency rental assistance for the lowest income people, money for housing choice vouchers to ensure long-term stability, funding to support homeless service providers and keep people experiencing homelessness safe, and specifically in billions of dollars in emergency rental assistance to renters to pay their back arrears and forward arrears. So you might have heard of emergency rental assistance coming through the Department of Treasury. That was something that we advocated for and, saw on a huge level, close to 50 billion in rental and utility assistance. While all of this was happening, we saw the enacting of a federal eviction moratoria, the first in the country, the first in our history. So it's been reinforced not only by the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, but then by Congress and extended by the Biden administration. So the current CDC eviction moratoria is in effect until June 30th, 2020, and that's at a national level, understanding that there are lots of challenges to it in several different courts. But we advocated for that and fought for that using a lot of that same data that folks really need support. They're on the precipice of being evicted and sharing stories of folks who are struggling, who were working, who just, again, don't have those savings because of how much they were already spending on rent and what that means, like the pipeline for folks who are spending too much on housing and at risk of homelessness, why it's important that we have a moratoria on eviction. So these were some of the things we advocated for and ultimately secured victories. But as I mentioned, next slide, these are just emergency stopgap measures, and we need to move forward to a long and deliberate goal of providing long-term solutions to ensure housing affordability. So we kind of think of this in these 5 major buckets. We believe we need to bridge the gap between incomes and housing costs. I'm thinking of that map that I presented around, what renter wage looks like. We need to expand and preserve that supply of affordable housing, making sure folks have units that they can get into and afford. We need to prevent evictions and housing instability by providing an increased bill of renters' rights. And we need to ensure equitable disaster recovery. I grew up in Houston, so I've seen how inequitable our disaster recovery system can be. It's really important that folks who are already struggling don't continue to struggle because they can't receive assistance or relief from a disaster. And we want to continue addressing fair housing and racial and economic inequities. So I mentioned this, it needs to be deliberate. We need to expand fair housing provisions and also acknowledge the importance of rectifying past wrongs. So the way we've been advocating for this, next slide, is through a national campaign. Using all of those tools I just talked about, we've been championing these 4 different approaches for a long-term housing affordability, not single act like a package, but a campaign to really build this into our federal policy. We believe that there's a lot of attention right now. There's a lot of political will and acknowledgement of housing as like almost this crisis that we're in. And we think that now is the time to advance anti-racist policies that are going to achieve large scale and sustained investments. I want to emphasize that we kind of see these as all interrelated and mutually reinforcing. So you can't have just one without any of the others. And also, I want to emphasize that we're trying to get these passed in various packages. So looking for any avenue we can to enact some of our priorities. This is also a place where I would love any feedback. So I'll have my information in the chat after where you can reach out and provide any feedback. But we believe in universal rental assistance. So right now, only 1 in 4 eligible households receives rental assistance. To make it universally available, we need to greatly expand through something like vouchers. We need to increase that supply. We need to provide emergency stabilization resources, and we need to enact renter protections. Next slide. On our website, you will see many details for how these can be enacted, but I'm running short on time, so I'll move through these fairly quickly. We want to make housing assistance available to all eligible households. Not that 1 in 4, but anyone whose income qualified should be able to receive housing assistance, like we do for SNAP. We think that we need to significantly expand and guarantee funding for housing choice vouchers. This could also look like a renter's tax credit, and on a very granular level, moving housing assistance to the mandatory side of congressional spending would be another avenue for this. So this is thinking about bridging that gap between what folks are earning and what they can afford. Next slide. The other thing we would need to do is expand and preserve that supply of affordable homes. So both in the private sector, expanding the National Housing Trust Fund to provide block grants to communities to build affordable housing units, as well as providing an investment in public housing. So we need to provide at least $70 billion to preserve and rehabilitate public housing. And we also need to look at opportunities to build additional public housing units. Next slide. If we think about how important emergency rental assistance has been to keeping folks in their homes, that should already be something that we're looking to formalize as a permanent fixture of our affordable housing policy. So creating something like a national housing stabilization fund for folks that just need short assistance so that they don't fall into homelessness. They might be facing an eviction. They need they need some type of emergency rental support. Looking at a way that we can keep folks stably housed when they're in crisis would be our third pillar. And finally, and this is where I really think about some of the racial equity components and redistributing some of this power, is we need to enact legislation to establish vital renter protections. So we know that right now there's an imbalance in power between renters and landlords. So some of the ways in which we think this could be, renter protections could be increased is by prohibiting source of income discrimination. So just because you're using a voucher doesn't mean you should be turned away from housing. Establishing and funding a national right to counsel so that folks that are facing eviction are entitled to legal representation in court, and expanding the Fair Housing Act to ban discrimination based on sexual orientation, gender identity, marital status, and source of income. These are some of the ways that we think we could advance renter protections. Next slide. So I talked about these kind of broadly, and I want to emphasize that they're mutually reinforcing. So an example is we want to increase the supply of vouchers, but we also need to increase the amount of units so that there are more units available to use those vouchers. We need to enact renter protections so that landlords can't discriminate against voucher holders. All of these different elements need to be incorporated for us to really see this monumental change in affordable housing policy. So the ways that you could take action are you can sign on to the House campaign's national letter, which is just calling for Congress to recognize our priorities and enact some of these long-term solutions. We also know that right now, the Biden administration has put out the American Jobs Plan to invest in America, create good paying jobs. And we really think that housing is a priority in any type of jobs or infrastructure package. So not just thinking about brick and mortar, but actually thinking about the homes that make up our vibrant communities. We're asking you now to contact your senators and emphasize some of these priorities using some of those advocacy techniques that I talked about. And then finally, like I mentioned, next slide. Oh, sorry. Like I mentioned, there are many ways to get involved. So taking action at any point, we have sign-ons, we have a lot of opportunities where you can add your organization and sign your voice on, as well as contacting your member of Congress with some of language that we already provide. But also, if you want to have sustained investment with our organization, we are a membership organization. So next slide. You can join as a member. Members make our work possible. You're also, able to, engage with our work more deeply. But we have memberships for individuals and organizations. All of our information, though, this is not a good sales pitch, I realize, is available to the public. So you can find it all on our website. Next slide. If you're interested in getting in touch with me, which I encourage you to do with any questions, concerns, feedback, or want just deeper engagement, this is my contact information. I'm part of our field team. So the whole purpose of my job is to talk about our housing priorities and to share information about housing and the homelessness crisis in America. So thank you so much. I'm here to answer questions. I think the last takeaway is that we know that there are challenges, but we also already have solutions to end the housing poverty and homelessness crisis. And together we can push for that political will to make it happen. Thanks.
Great, thanks a lot, and thank you, Olivia. That was great to hear. I'm happy to say that at the National Alliance to End Homelessness, the National Low Income Housing Coalition has for many years been one of our closest and most important allies. And I think listening to Olivia will let everyone know why that is. I want to talk in a little more detail about some of the things that are on the table in the U.S. Congress right now. So some of the things we're encouraging people to advocate about. I'll start by talking about sort of the two big things that we need to do to end homelessness, just at risk of massively oversimplifying the problem. We need a homeless system so that if someone becomes homeless, there will be outreach to them, to engage them, and to keep them safe and to get them stably housed as quickly as possible. And that's what most of the people who work in homeless programs are working on, that in one way or another, to great effect and doing a great job. But the other thing we need housing that's affordable and stable so that people aren't becoming homeless all the time. I mean, we're hearing from people all over the country about how their homeless systems are doing better than ever, getting people off the streets, getting people out of shelters and into housing. But for every person they house, 4 more people are showing up at the door of the shelter looking for help because they've just lost their housing and become homeless. So those two tasks are what we're looking for federal policy to support. So next slide, please. This is a time of opportunities right now. I mean, in looking back on many years of working on housing and homelessness at the federal level, I have to say that the new administration that's come in and the work that Congress has put on the table and the leadership in the Congress we've seen things that we've never seen before in terms of the willingness to fund these programs and to get this done. So I want to talk a lot about opportunities today. Now, one opportunity is, of course, things that they've already passed, and these are amounts of money that are sort of unheard of in this regard. That we have $9 billion has been passed in 2 different enactments already for specifically for homelessness. Just to give some perspective, the whole regular HUD homeless programs, the continuum of care and the ESG program that you apply for every year, that's $3 billion a year. So $9 billion in extra a year on top of that that's an opportunity in itself. Olivia talked about the rental assistance, the emergency rental assistance, $46 billion. That's like almost the whole HUD budget. Is $46 billion. And then new vouchers and new availability. There's the voucher, the Section 8 voucher, the Housing Choice Voucher Program has been changed to make more people eligible. The HUD VASH program has been expanded in terms of eligibility. Youth who are aging out of child welfare, who are at great risk of homelessness, we know, have vouchers available to them through an enactment of Congress that HUD is in the process of working with the child welfare agencies at the federal level and the state level to enact. So those are some opportunities that arise from the funding that's already been passed. So next slide, please. In terms of what's coming down the pike, I'm going to talk about sort of three different kinds of things. There's homeless assistance, so that's funding the homeless system. There's for lack of a better term, I talk about the big housing issues, which is a lot of what Olivia already talked about, and some of the opportunities there. And then the emergency rental assistance that's already been on the table and the opportunity to enact more of that. Next slide, please. So there's sort of two kinds of legislation that are on the table and that people are talking about right now. One is emergency legislation. So they've already passed a couple of emergency bills, the CARES Act, the American Rescue Plan Act that passed just last March. The President Biden has a proposal out for another big emergency bill, and there's several different names people talk about it as. It's the Recovery Plan, the American Jobs Plan, the Infrastructure Bill. It's all talking about the same thing. The president's proposal is, in general terms, people in Congress are working at what the specifics will be, and they haven't come up, in a lot of cases, on the housing things, they haven't really come up with specifics yet, but they're in the process of doing that. So it's a very important time to be advocating with members of Congress right now. The next emergency bill that's coming up is what the president said he wanted to see in there is housing development. Olivia already talked about investments in public housing, investments in the National Low-Income Housing Trust Fund to build more housing, basically. Project-based rental assistance is part of that, as people know, and Olivia said, just subsidizing the building of housing will get you housing that's too expensive for people to afford if their incomes are so low that they're really at risk of homelessness. So there needs to be rental assistance associated with the new housing development. The Biden proposal says he wants to see rental assistance, doesn't say how much, doesn't say where it will come from. So that's something that's still being worked out. And then the voucher program is something that really the president's proposal doesn't really talk about, but it's something that the president talked about when he was running for office, which puts us in the situation where we have to try to hold him to that. The idea of the voucher program, the Section 8 Housing Choice Voucher Program, I would just reiterate what's been said already. That becoming a universal entitlement would be the most important thing the federal government has done for low-income people since the enactment of of Medicaid and the Fair Housing Act in the 1960s legislation. This would be to bring the need for housing up to where those other 60s versions of great legislation need to be. So that's an important piece. Will that be part of this recovery plan? We don't know yet. We're working hard for it. We know that the Low Income Housing Coalition is working hard for it. We hope other people will work hard for it. If there's a universal entitlement for vouchers passed, it will be several years to ramp it up. And there's a lot of questions about how fast it'll be ramped up, who will get help first, how housing will be built so that there's places to use the new vouchers. These are all questions that are really on the table, and people in Congress really need help figuring out. Next slide, please. Now, another piece that was in Biden's recovery proposal the emergency bill that's not so much housing, but is very related to housing, is this issue of home and community-based services. People who work in the homeless field know that the use of permanent supportive housing has shown a great impact on getting people with very severe medical problems housed permanently. The permanent supportive housing model involves rent subsidies and affordable rental, but it also involves medical type services that are often very hard to get. The idea of home and community-based services really started as a proposal that people who are aging and have homes already would be able to age in place, not have to go into nursing homes. But it's becoming more apparent as specific proposals have come on the table that this would include the kinds of services that people in permanent supportive housing need. So this is another issue that's been raised by the president's recovery package, and that there's a lot of support for in Congress, making this part of the Medicaid program that every state would need to use, but increasing the federal funding and decreasing the state funding for that. If people know the Medicaid program at all, they know it's a joint federal state program. This is a key item for people who care about homelessness. Next slide, please. Now, besides the emergency legislation, there's also the regular annual funding appropriations, the appropriations bills and regular annual funding. People who've come to our conferences or participated in our Hill Days know this is something we work on every year. Our idea is to build the homeless assistance program up year after year so it gets closer and closer to scale. The same as the voucher program. The president has not put out a fully detailed budget proposal for the next fiscal year's regular appropriations, but he did put out a general outline, and it included a couple of details that are very exciting for people working on homelessness and housing. One is an increase of homeless assistance to $3.5 billion. So the last bill that Congress passed funded that at $3 billion. The $500 million increase would be the biggest increase in that program really ever since the homeless assistance program first started getting ramped up in the 80s. So this just means more ability to serve people rather than put people on waiting lists when they come to.
All right, folks, looks like we're having some technical issues here. Give me just a second.
Hi, I'm back. Can you hear me?
There we go.
Sorry about that.
We can hear you, Steve.
Don't know
Yep.
what's going on. But yeah, these
Looks like we're playing Wi-Fi tag today. Hold on.
Hey, y'all, while we're waiting.
All right, looks like we're back up and running.
Okay, sorry, I don't know what the problem is, but let me talk faster and I'll get done before it cuts out again. So next slide, please. Okay, so just to summarize, we want things from the new administration. We want things from Congress. We need the new administration to make homelessness and housing a priority. They need to be talking about it all the time. They've been pretty good at that so far. Marcia Fudge, the new HUD secretary, is on Twitter all the time talking about what they're trying to get done. We need them to implement homeless programs in a good way, really focus on racial disparities that have been created by housing programs and use these housing programs and homelessness programs to fix those. Coordinating with healthcare is a big part of what the administration needs to do, and particularly matching the specialized services with housing as part of a permanent supportive housing model. Next slide, please. And then Congress's agenda, funding closer to scale for the homelessness programs, the housing programs move toward a universal scale, and then working on the specialized medical services such as the home and community-based services. These are the real big things that are on their agenda that could have a huge impact and that we're all needing to educate people about. Next slide, please. One of the things we're doing is we're having an advocacy, a virtual Capitol Hill Day. We usually do a summer conference, as people know. That didn't happen. The hotel we had a contract with went out of business. Still too much COVID, so we're not doing that. But we are having a virtual Capitol Hill Day on June 16th. You can contact Jerry Jones is our staff person who's running that. I know the Texas Homelessness Network is already involved in this, so that's great, and thank you so much to them. Or you can contact me about that as well if you're interested. We need to get people on the Hill understanding what's at stake here, what the opportunities are, and what we can do. So next slide, please. And this is me. If you want to talk more, if there's more questions you have, if you want to get involved with the Hill Day, please be in touch. Thanks again to Olivia. Thanks again to the Texas Homeless Network. Great allies of ours for a long, long time, and we're going to get some really important work done this year. I'm feeling very strong about it.
Thank you, Steve. I'm going to take us into the final room, and let's get the last of these Q&As answered for y'all. Let's see, where did we leave off? Okay, this one's for Steve. Where does zoning reform fit into all these efforts, especially in a state that illegalizes most zoning reforms? Basically, all cities that can do in Texas is create a housing trust fund to create affordable housing.
Right. So I feel like zoning reform is one of the most important things we can do. You know, what we hear from the federal policymakers is, oh, that's a local issue. We can't touch that. So it is a local issue, and it needs every mayor in the country who's complaining about homelessness and why are there so many homeless people in my city needs to seriously face the idea of, well, like, what are
I know we lost him just a second, y'all.
Let's see. Thanks, Tiffany. Okay, let's see if Steve's still here. We'll get him reattached. Actually, maybe Olivia, you can answer this one too. Beyond rental assistance, is there any evidence that local rental caps can help cost burden households? I mean, because every time a McMansion pops up in my neighborhood, my rent goes up $500 every year. Either one of y'all. So we're just gonna play tag with Steve today.
It looked like Steve was gonna like jump in right in that moment. So I will say again, I don't know if he's back and he wants to answer. I will say, like, I've caveated many of my answers. I don't want it to sound like I'm not answering or I'm deflecting the question, but I think as a matter, NLIHC focuses on federal advocacy. So we, haven't supported a national bill to like cap rents. And I think that on a large part, like when we're talking about, I can put a link to one of our tenant talks that talks about gentrification and displacement and how there needs to be investment in communities. Like, we're not saying no investment. There needs to be investment, but coupled with protections and investments in housing for folks at risk of displacement, so that it's not investment and displacement. It's investment in folks who have lived there for a long time, have a right to remain there. So, I think that we often leave that, we often say, like, that's an important thing to consider at the local level. And I think that our belief is by addressing these larger, these larger funding streams and federal levers, that it will alleviate some of those pressures at the local level. But like my answer that is like not as fun is that often, like when it comes to specific like rent control, we just say like any provision that helps the lowest income renter, but often we leave that to the local level, the city or state, as far as like rental caps. But I will say in all of our work, because we have this specific focus on the lowest income renters, we believe very strongly in income targeting, so that resources, right? I think Steve backed this up, and I saw this in the chat, understanding that the private sector is not going to build affordable housing for the lowest income renters. It's like the market is not going to build for that. So that means that you need to have federal programs that like accept that and build for that and prioritize that. And I think that's why we often champion income targeting, because we see that folks will continue to get left out unless it's deliberate.
Okay, let's see. Next one was, or Nick, go
Craig, real quick, let's go ahead and do the questions that were particularly for Steve, since it seems like we have a good signal with him right now. And
I exist momentarily.
Well, also, Steve, if it happens again, we can always have you come back without your camera. That may help with some of the Wi-Fi issues too.
That might. Let me just turn my camera off right now, just because that sometimes helps.
And then once we get through, I think there are 2 more questions for Steve, and then we'll ask some more for both of them, assuming that we have time.
Next up was, we're in an economy that requires next one, sorry. Texas has legalized source of income discrimination. Without the help of our own state legislature, how can we fight for SOI voucher protections on the federal level?
So there are people pushing federal bills to get rid of source of income discrimination. We don't have a sense that there's we have some work to do building support to get those passed, I think, let me put it nicely. But I think, part of it is just the programs we need to also make sure that this is the reason we need to put development money on the table, so we have nonprofit developers who are out there more mission driven to serve low income people. So I think there is some work. There is some possibilities at the federal level, but again, it's going to take some work.
Right. Okay, I think next one. Many of the folks on this call are direct service providers, advocates, and people who've lived experience. How would you all see the work that you are doing on the federal level at NLIHC and NAH impacting their day to day?
Well, I would start by, I hope that I think the resources that a lot of people are have available, I think is a very big part of our work. I mean, we do that work with Congress to raise money because we know that the money gets sent to the local level, and then people who are the direct service providers are using that to have just amazing results for people who no one else is looking out for. So this is, I think that's one impact. But then the other thing, like we try to do besides policy, we also try to make sure that people have a chance to learn from each other in different parts of the country about how to address the problems that they're facing locally, and how to get programs with the greatest kind of impacts.
I think that was all the general cues that were in the chat. Let me take a double look real quick. But actually, I do have one for me. Post-COVID, what do you think this is going to look like? Is all this money going to go away and we're going to go back to the kind of coffers that we had before this, or we're going to be able to maintain this same level?
That's the $1 million question that I mean, I feel that there is, I feel Olivia said something which I think is really true, that the understanding of why housing is important for all kinds of different reasons has, I think, grown in this country. And I think the seeing more people become homeless and seeing people lose their housing during the pandemic, I think drove that home for a lot of people. I'm pretty optimistic about what the next like 5 or 6 years is going to hold in this regard. But as I keep saying, it's not going to happen by itself. It's not going to happen just because, oh, everybody's awakened their interest and understanding now. It's going to happen because the people who really know, who are the people you were talking about, are in there, like, not letting go of it.
Be fatigued because we know that we just had this incredible crisis and we needed emergency response funding, but that doesn't mean that that's getting us to the place we want to go. So I think that's, yeah, right. The $1 million question is that, like, we want to make sure that we're still emphasizing, like, this is great, we want to celebrate, but we need to make long-standing investments that are going to address some of the core inequities that were there before the pandemic. Like, these were inequities that have been baked into many of our policy systems, into our, private market, that we need to, like, devote resources to outside of a big spending bill that's going to, that's directed at COVID relief. So I think that's one of the things that we've really tried to underscore is, I know we've been saying it for a year that we need more rental assistance, but we needed rental assistance before the pandemic. And you know that, if you've been working in direct assistance for many years, if you have lived experience. I think one other thing, and, is I think my family lives in Texas, and they've been saying, housing prices are going up, like, so many more people are moving here. It's tying together, and this is, I think, some of the narrative work that we need to do at the national level and that you can do in your own communities, is tethering those individual experiences, like, it's getting more expensive to live here. Like, that why question, it's getting more expensive to live here because folks are moving here, and that's driving, housing prices up, and there's not enough housing stock, or we're not allowing for, like, dense zoning, or we're not building for the lowest income renters. Or we're pushing folks out of neighborhoods where they'd had supportive services. I'm thinking about in Austin, to areas where, they don't have supportive services, and maybe they don't even have a bus line that goes to their community. So I think that's some of the narrative work that, people saw folks lined up at the San Antonio Food Bank, in their cars during COVID. It's making sure that you make the connection that, like, actually a lot of people were already living that reality prior to the pandemic, and that individualized experience, those people over there, actually, that's a product of a system that you're also a part of. And I think that that's some of the work that we'll need to continue doing, is making sure that COVID wasn't seen as a once it happened. We're all vaccinated. We're moving on. It's hard to both celebrate and continue to build. And I think we're seeing that both in the personal work that we're doing and probably in many of our communities, as well as like convincing our legislators to use their political capital for these types of investments.
So one thing I would like it if everyone did would be find a way to build relationships with elected officials at the federal level, with members of Congress, and whoever it is. You know, it's like it's inviting somebody to tour a facility, or just getting together at a going to one of their open houses or anything, just or setting a meeting in DC, or an online meeting, a virtual meeting. Now it's sometimes easier to get. Build those relationships. You're doing something, people are working on homelessness, are doing something really good for their community. Elected officials, members of Congress, they want to be associated with good things that are happening in their community. That's how they get reelected. So make sure they know that something that the work you're doing on homelessness is something good that's happening in your community. And the thing I'm hopeful about is, like, I'm hopeful that so many people are talking about housing now, affordable housing, real affordable, stable housing for everybody, no matter how low their income is, in to an extent that's never happened before for me, and I'm very hopeful about it.
You're seeing. So I'm looking at Harmony's question about your mayor of your county pretending homelessness doesn't exist. What's a way that is important? Again, right, targeting. What's a way of conveying to her something else that she cares about? Maybe she doesn't care about homelessness, but she cares about children. Like, you know, and how do you message then around, like, actually housing instability leads to poor performance in schools, or maybe folks care about access to healthy food. I used to do some census work. And one of the things that you emphasize is, like, just put a slide in all of your slide decks about the importance of the census, like across all of your different presentations. Just like find the pivot, find the way of bringing housing into your conversations. And I think you'll find that it's more natural, because maybe this is my own personal belief, that housing affects all of these other, different strains, all these other policy issues. If you're talking about small businesses, like, where are workers living? If you're thinking about investment, like, are there those same, protections to encourage the community members to be able to stay and thrive? Access to parks. The new park is opening, who can access it? Who's living around it? Just that continued question of, like, how housing intersects. I think that's one tool, is just continuing to find those tethers, because everyone has their thing that they care about. And I guarantee you a lot of times it intersects with housing. So that's one thing I would say, is just, like, consistent messaging and finding a way to tie it in. I had talked a little bit about moving from the individual, like, don't let the conversation be about individual actions, but how we're all participants, and how we all have a duty to care about affordable housing and our neighbors and our communities, kind of building on some of that, like, COVID messaging of caring about your community. And the other thing I would say is just, when you're thinking about engaging, we have tools on our website where, you can click in and say, it says, like, contact my senator, and you just put in your name and information, and Ted Cruz comes up and the message is already crafted. And you can send that type of message. A lot of organizations already have that pre-baked in tool that has some of the messaging that you can change. And I think for even someone like me, it helps to see a message there, like the language already used, and to be able to add your story. So I would say, don't be afraid to take that action. And also, maybe I don't want to put Steve out here, but at least for me, I'm really available. If you have a question, if you're seeing something in a community, if you want a presentation, if you're asking about a training, I feel like, especially at NLIHC and some of our other organizations, we get the strength of our messaging from folks who are on the ground. So it's never a burden. Right. It's always an opportunity to convene. It's always an opportunity to share, to ground our message. And I think that's what's most important about the advocacy we're talking about. It's saying that there is a problem with a number and then backing it up with a story about what does the human element of this look like in a way that often is not extractive, but can honestly share the face of a story or brings that person to the table to tell their own story. So I would say just looking at different avenues to plug in and starting where you're comfortable with. What I would also say.
Great.
Well, that brings us to the end of this monthly webinar. Thank you so much to Olivia and Steve for joining us today, and thank you to everyone who is watching.
Great. Thank you, everybody, for the work you do.
Thanks, y'all.
Thank y'all. All the presentations are below the cameras today, and all the websites with all the other relevant information has been linked as well. It will be in the recording, and we will again get this posted as soon as we can. Enjoy the next 9 free minutes of your life.
All right. Thank you.
Have a good day, everybody.
Bye.